Hello, hello. Welcome to your final session of the day. My name is Michael Hardwick Brown. I am your session facilitator. We always have housekeeping that we need to take care of. There's a question like, did anyone go to the keynote? Did we all go to the keynote? Was it good? I was busy. They make me work, so I didn't get it. But okay. After this, welcome reception in the expo hall. That's where you can buy cybersecurity and have a couple drinks at the same time. We have, they really want you to complete your session surveys in the app, so you can judge these guys. Yeah. So without further ado, I'm going to call these guys up. We've got Matt, James, and Michael. Come on up, guys.
So keep away from speakers, right, from the feedback.
Yep.
So just want to introduce myself. So my name is James Baker. I'm the CISO for an organization called Cohesity. And joining me today is Michael.
Michael Perryman, yeah.
Yeah, and Matthew. So we're all going to do a slot. We're basically talking about various different elements of the same problem, and that is dealing with ransomware. So I'm going to frame it up by talking about the ransomware problems specifically in healthcare and some of the common problems that we've seen in organizations that I've been in that have handled not just ransomware but wiper attacks as well. So my team were involved in the Saudi Aramco response where 55,000 servers were wiped. Some of the problems like how do you even physically get in a building where no door access controls are available because the systems have been wiped? So in there, we also had to buy 5,000 typewriters to actually physically type up the incident response process and have human runners running around. Like, we live in a very different world with ransomware. Then Michael's going to talk about the hospital, the impacts of the event, and the general situation that had occurred there, followed by Matthew, who's going to give us a little bit of a conversation about the process they went through that incident response. And then we're going to go back to Michael at the end and talk about the hospital today. What preparations have they put in place to make sure they're not impacted in the future? So trends in ransomware in healthcare. So the first thing is, why do people attack hospitals? Because they pay. Right? That is the major reason. When human lives are involved, organizations are far more likely to pay ransoms, and an awful lot of hospitals have paid ransoms. And in fact, 66% of all US hospitals have had some form of a ransomware incident, which is an awful lot. And at least 4 deaths, not just in the US, this is globally, have been associated to impacts related to ransomware. And there are actually some legal cases going on at the moment to sue those hospitals for not having due care and due diligence. And then just some statistics around ransomware. The average time to recover critical patient care in ransomware incidents is 168 hours. So Michael's going to talk much more about the impacts to the particular organization he was within. But you imagine not being able to deliver that ICU care to patients for 168 hours, like not knowing what drugs you should or should not be giving that patient. Only 2% of the people or organizations that paid ransom actually got all their data back. And again, Michael will talk about the quality of data needed to provide care. Is 99% of data enough to be able to provide good care? Or will that 1% of data that's missing be enough to get that patient ill or even killed? And then the average amount of data that was recovered by organizations that paid that ransom, 65%. The other thing people don't realize about ransomware attacks is normally when you get the decryption keys, you get a MAC address and a decryption key. Right? If you've got no CMDB, if that's been impacted, how do you know which machine, how do you know which embedded medical device has that particular MAC address? right, to go around? Can you even decrypt some of that with the closed operating systems and everything else that exists within some of these medical devices? So paying the ransom is not the right way to go, but as we've learned, a lot of hospitals do. So before ransomware came along, when I used to work with hospitals in incident response, and this is generally any kind of incident, when we used to only have to worry about exfiltration events. And I remember being a CISO 20 years ago when I was a CISO at an organization called Mimecast. All I had to worry about was data theft, fundamentally. That was my only problem. Denial of service, data theft. And the only real impacts were reputational damage. And that is largely overblown. If you look at the organizations that have been hit by exfiltration attacks, the Targets, the Home Depots, the Maersks, the JP Morgans, another one of my ex-employers, are they out of business? No, they're not. They have a temporal dip in share value. Most of them come back from having some form of cyber incident. Regulatory fines. I live in Europe, I'm obviously English, and so GDPR, really big issue for us. So making sure we have that due care and that due diligence, that's becoming more important. Legal, getting sued by the data subjects whose data you've lost. Right? These were secondary losses. They don't really get worse over time unless you really, really, really mess up the incident response. Your reputational damage has already happened. You already haven't looked after the data properly. So these are largely a sunk cost. But the difference is with ransomware is we now have an operational impact. The organization can't deliver products and services. In the case of a hospital, that could kill people, right? Or you're delivering care not to the level at which you should be able to, because the supporting systems aren't there. And we are heavily reliant on technology these days. So there are two misconceptions I see, and a large part of my job is I talk to customers that are using Cohesity as well as support internal capabilities, and I hear these two things when we talk about ransomware. Ransomware recovery and response requires IT and security to work together. Two organizations that traditionally, have had sometimes very adversarial relationships. But there are two assumptions which cause fundamental problems. The first one is from the CIO, and that is, I'm going to treat a ransomware incident like every other kind of incident that I deal with from a data recovery and backup perspective. And they think it's just like a flood, a fire, a misconfiguration, or loss of electricity. And in those incidents, the root cause is largely known. If you walk into a data center, it's 3 foot underwater, or it's very hot in there, you kind of know what the fundamental problem is. The difference with the cyber incident is we don't know that, right? We don't know. We have to do response investigation. Everyone in this conference is all involved in that DFIR process. So in traditional disaster recovery, we're backing up or we're replicating to a second data center, we have a crisis event, and we simply bring it back, right? We recover from that. And that is what an awful lot of organizations are doing in cyber attacks. Right? But what we have is obviously MITRE ATT&CK framework, last 12 tactics up there, they dwell, right? So what they are doing is they are in your backup for potentially however long the dwell period is. And the case today, it was a very short dwell period, but even in that time, the artifacts of that attack were backed up. So if we just recover that without investigating, any defense evasions, any accounts that were created, any persistence mechanisms, any binaries that were in there are just brought back onto those production systems. So we are literally recovering from that backup, and we are bringing the badness back to production systems. The second problem we have is adversary to targeting backups, and we'll hear more from Michael about this earlier. So a lot of the legacy backup systems were never built to live in an organization where adversaries are actually attacking them to prevent you from being able to recover from them. Big problem, right? We need to make sure that we protect those backup platforms from attack to make sure that last line of defense that backup is obvious, talked about as exists so that we can get there. Third problem, sorry. And this comes back to the CISO's preconception, and that is, I'm going to treat a ransomware incident like every other exfiltration incident I have. So I'm going to roll the same workflows that I have for forensic analysis and for investigation of those incidents that I do for day-to-day BAU activities, right? I'm going to treat ransomware and wiper incidents no differently. The trouble is that we're relying on endpoint agents quite a lot of the time, and we all know that in the MITRE attack framework, the tactic with the most amount of techniques under it is defense evasion. Right? We're relying on agents on a box that has been owned as our pure mechanism of detection, of our mechanism of response. And we're seeing in an awful lot of situations, they're just being switched off. Right? The backups are getting infected, and then people have no mechanism to be able to investigate that incident. Even worse, because we live in largely homogeneous environments, we're either Linux, Windows, or both, right? The entire response system is flattened, right? So Saudi Aramco, we had no SIM, we had no phone. Government's trying to phone us to get updates on what's happening, voice over IP, no phones. Oxy is settling the door open to get in there. No SOC, no SIM, no email, no case management. Everything is flattened. So you need to, in a ransomware and wiper incident, recover the ability to respond before you can even do the response. And that's a lot of people haven't thought about that. And when you actually look at their, the importance of different systems and how quickly they get them back up, the security response capabilities aren't even considered in that. It's all business critical services. Saudi Aramco, oil kept flowing, but we couldn't respond to the incident. So what was the most important thing? So I'm going to talk about clean moving very quickly. So what you really need in these situations is the ability to recover that capability in order to respond in an environment which is not accessible to the adversary. Right? So that is the first thing, and we're going to hear some more about how that was actually achieved in that organization. The second thing where we've seen backups actually being very useful is the fact that you've actually got forensic evidence over time. Right? So if you think about it, if you are snapshotting your systems several times a day, instead of just having a forensic image at the end of an incident, which may not be available anyway, because some of the evidence may have been wiped by a wiper or encrypted by the ransomware capability itself, you've now got an ability to go backwards and forwards in time during that incident to reinstantiate those systems at various points in time to look at the artifacts that are on those file systems, or pull those artifacts out via an API using something like a SAW. So the other thing that you can do is also reinstantiate those systems and redeploy that XDR tooling so the adversary can't turn it off. They can't evade it because you're reinstantiating that XDR system at a point in time. And you could do that 30, 60, 90 days ago, 180 days ago, and see what processes are created, what network connections are attempted, what file system changes are made. And that's a kind of, backups have never been an particularly sexy thing in cybersecurity. And I spent 10 years building SOCs, my team. But now, being a CISO at an organization where I have access to that backup as a forensics capability, something I never thought about before. Right? It was something that was owned by IT that I could never use before. So there's just a couple of ideas there around some of the problems that are happening and the preconceptions that are made, and also some of the places where we're seeing some organizations actually starting to see data management as a way to support cybersecurity capabilities. So I'd like to pass it over to Michael, who's actually going to talk about one particular instance where that occurred. So, thank you.
My name is Michael Perryman. I am the manager of secure network architecture. I work in information security as well as infrastructure. Talk about SkyLakes a little bit. SkyLakes Medical Center is located in Klamath Falls, Oregon. We have about 176 beds. We service somewhere around 10,000 square miles, and in both Lake as well as Klamath counties. We do serve rural communities, so it is a rural hospital. We have a heliport. We do acute care. We have an ICU. Imaging is very big with what our organization does. We also take care of women's health, occupational therapy, orthopedics, outpatient services. We do have an emergency room, so fairly full service as far as our medical center is concerned, especially for being a rural hospital. Probably the closest hospitals that are going to be to us in our area, if you go outside of our area, would be probably about 3 hours away or about an hour and a half away over a mountain. So we're kind of the closest place to serve our community and to serve our patients. We house somewhere, I'd say that's probably now more closer to 3,500 desktops and about 600 servers, whether that be physical and or virtual servers. During the incident, we basically had to revert to paper processes, so downtime procedures became extremely important. However, those processes are also very inefficient. And so when you have those processes and you have nurses that are trying to take care of patients with a paper process, it becomes very inefficient. We had cancer patients that we had to turn away to go to a different hospital because we weren't able to take care of them at the time. Nurses were definitely worried about losing their licenses during the process because of the fact that we didn't have the systems to know what kind of medications that we needed to assimilate to patients, and from there the correct medication and what the dosage was. So from that, there is a liability that can come with that. All third-party systems that we were connected to had to be shut down. Any kind of VPNs, site-to-site VPNs, any kind of infrastructure. We are a community connect with an Epic hospital, and so we had to actually shut down our Epic instance with that as well. So all of those interconnects had to be shut down, could have no data going through them. Email was definitely shut down. Our only real form of communication at that point was quickly standing up something like telehealth, as well as a communication system through collaboration. And our legacy backups that we had before, as we were going back through them, they were completely encrypted. So from there, we were able to move to a different form or a backup solution, and from that backup solution, we were able to recover. But when you're in this kind of situation and you walk into the data center and it's quiet, no fans, nothing running, that's a very scary situation. So when you're talking about patients, patient care, being able to take care of those patients, as well as your workforce, and not being able to work within the same processes that you use on a regular basis, that becomes a situation where sometimes you don't really know what to do. We engaged our insurance company for the next day for assigning third-party incident response, and they were able to come on site, but it took them several days to be there. So we went through several, we tried to actually restore systems. Every time we tried to restore a system, it would actually be re-encrypted. And so we saw that many times. We invoked a disaster recovery plan, but several systems, wouldn't restore. Again, they were infected within just a few minutes. At that point, From north to south, we knew that we were infiltrated, and then also noticed things started to move from east to west, and that's when we were able to see the actual ransomware note that was on our systems. Now we'll hand this to Matt.
All right, thanks. Yeah, how's everyone doing? I'm Matthew. I am a senior manager on the Cisco Talos incident response team. We are a global incident response service. We provide our customers with 24/7 access to digital forensic incident responders. We're not a siloed organization, so when I say global, we're genuinely global. I got individuals that report to me who live in Qatar, who live in Spain, who live in Chicago, and we all work together to help customers solve their problems. We have a fair number of our customers are hospitals, and we had the I guess unfortunate opportunity to help SkyLakes with their problem. And I'll talk a little bit about what we did, right? So SkyLakes reached out to us, Cisco Talos. They were having some issues, as Michael mentioned. They were trying to restore their systems from backup, and what's fairly common with these sorts of incidents is that the adversary has a pretty strong foothold in the environment, and when you're trying to restore to the infected environment, the systems are almost guaranteed to get reinfected. And so you sit there and you spin your wheels and you pull your hair out and you're not sure what's going on, and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety in what is already a very stressful situation, right? So we assigned our normal team, which consists of an incident commander and 2 incident response consultants, along supported by a threat intelligence and interdiction expert, and a manager, which in this case happened to be me, who just kind of supervises things in the background and then takes credit for it at the end, right? That's how that works. We supported SkyLakes with digital forensics and helped guide them into how to resolve the incident, provided them a plan of actions and monitored the execution of those plans of action and whatnot, right? So I want to talk quickly about the incident response process, but I'm going to be super brief about this, right? So one of the things, so this is just the NIST incident response process. We just broke it out and had our Talos graphics people spice it up a little bit, right? But as you can see, so SkyLakes kind of jumped to the eradication and recovery part of the incident response process because, of course, it's a panicky situation. You got patients that need help, and you want to be as fast as possible in getting those systems back up and running. Sometimes, though, when that happens, depending on the type of malware that's being used, you just kind of sit there and you don't make any progress, right? You're constantly restoring stuff. SkyLakes didn't have the in-house capability to perform forensics and didn't have the expertise to do so, so they called us to assist. That's what we do. And we provided them with analysis along with very concrete directions on how to contain the incident, which I'll talk about in the next slide here. So building a clean room, I want to talk, this is a pretty common recommendation that we come right out of the box when a customer has a incident, like in this case it was Baser Loader, but we also have Emotet, TrickBot, CACBot, operate kind of similarly in that the piece of malware will continuously replicate itself and give the adversary the ability to regain a foothold. So while you're reimaging, the hosts are being reinfected, which sucks. And but the way that we help protect that and we minimize the risk of impact is we recommend customers start to silo and segment their networks. This is really high level, right? In reality, this is considerably more complicated, but in a high level, we treat the existing infected network as though it's just scorched earth, right? We don't trust anything that's in that environment anymore. Even if a host says it's clean, we don't believe it's clean. It's bad, it's dirty, it's hanging out in the infected environment. Then, as the hosts are restored or reimaged, depending on what process the customer decides to choose, in this case, thanks to their awesome backup system, they were able to restore many of these. We restore them to a middle staging segment. In that staging segment, we keep an eye on it for a bit and make sure that it isn't getting reinfected, that it didn't come over with malware, that we didn't restore a host with the malware already on it, which happens sometimes for some customers, right? You make a mistake and you don't restore far back enough. But it gives us an opportunity to look, keep an eye on things. Also, this whole recovery process is being done by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. I make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes, right? And sometimes I've had customers, not necessarily in SkyLakes situation, but I've had customers take an infected host, forget to re-image it, and throw it in the staging segment, and we catch it. It's not a big deal, right? That's what that staging segment's there for, is to catch human error. Once we validate that those hosts are clean, that in some cases we might do spot check forensic analysis on them to make sure that the adversary's accounts aren't still being used in that environment. We then okay to move that over to the clean segment, and that clean segment is your new production segment. Ideally, they would just stay there. The really neat thing too about this setup is that if customers don't have the segmentation already in place, this staging segment can just stay there after the incident if they want. And then if you have an incident later, you can drop a host into that staging segment for re-imaging or analysis, or to segment it away. So it's really cool to have this stuff in place and keep it in there afterwards, right? All right. So what made this incident, so, not to, the incident itself wasn't particularly anything unique from a Talos IR perspective. No offense to SkyLakes, right? It was not meant to be personal here, right? But it was Baser loader with Ryuk, and it was performing normal Baser loader, Cobalt Strike Ryuk sort of activities, right? Nothing really surprising there. What happens usually, though, is when Ryuk executes it, it actively destroys information, right? It's just the nature of what it does. It's ransomware. It destroys forensic evidence. And it sometimes can be very hard for us, if not impossible, to determine root cause when the evidence has been destroyed. Thankfully, though, because of the really amazing backup system, and this is one of the few times that this has worked out, and certainly worked out so quickly, is that we were actually able to restore hosts in their infected state and do forensic analysis on those infected backups. And from that, we were able to find root cause, which is always something to celebrate, right? Figuring out what root cause is. Because from that root cause, we can provide more robust recommendations. We can provide weight behind those recommendations that were given, right? So if, in this case, it was an email attachment, or it was a link to a malicious document, I should say. And so there's a clear recommendation that comes out of that, is, improve our email filtering and look at suspicious URLs and whatnot, right? And it also provided us with the ability to be able to respond rapidly, the ease of evidence collection aided by SkyLakes, and the backups just led to a really great, awesome, successful incident response. Again, it's not so awesome for SkyLakes, but part of what I enjoy about this job is solving complex problems, and it's a lot of fun when we learn something new. And the advantage to having the backups was just amazing, right? So let's talk a little bit about what this clean room process looked like in SkyLakes situation, right? So after they got infected, they started shutting things down and walling things up and reacting to that, what Michael said, right, is there was 600 servers and 2,500 endpoints were pulled offline, right? From that, they started a backup recovery process that at first wasn't very successful, but thanks to once we started doing forensics on those clones, we were able to identify hosts that were likely compromised and able to provide better recommendations. We also recommended during the same process that SkyLakes produce a clean room infrastructure, and hosts were then instantly restored into the staging segment where they were reviewed, and any potential opportunities for new evidence collection were identified there. Critical files were recovered, and then not just recovered, but vetted in this staging network to make sure that we trust them before we start putting them into production. And that allowed a more systematic approach to restoring things, right? So nothing was restored to production until we knew that it was going to be clean, right? And then this is maybe more of a SkyLakes comment here. They also, at the end of this process, they were able to reach out to their vendors and customers and let them know what happened and that things are okay, and that they were able to confidently say that, at least in the case of the Ryuk Baser loader incident, that it had been cleaned up, right? All right. So I do want to talk, I'm maybe talking a little fast here, so I apologize, but I do want to talk a bit about the actual incident timeline. And it's really short, right? When you look at this timeline, we talked about dwell time. It's not uncommon for an adversary to gain access and spend 30, 60 days hanging around, stealing stuff, planning how they're going to destroy all the data and how they're going to make your life really awful, right? So, but in this case, it turned around pretty quickly. After we did our forensic analysis and we put together a timeline, we found that on October 26th, all these times are in UTC, by the way, at 1908 UTC, that a Google document, which is, we found this from recovered data, by the way, this link to this Google document we didn't know was there previous, was this annual bonus.pdf, was a URL that was accessed from an email that was sent to a user. Almost immediately afterwards, it starts a command and control session, and then drops and executes a form of Baser loader in this rep-termination.exe file for Baser loader. By 1934, we see the adversary starting to enumerate the network. It's using NL test to query Active Directory and look at what's where your domain controllers are and what their names are and what it's going to, and the adversary is going to start planning its attack. Then we see another instance of Baser loader being dropped, and we see lateral movement and execution of that Baser loader file after that, right? At 1954, we see PowerShell execution of Cobalt Strike, which indicates that an adversary is interacting with these systems at this point, and then is using bits admin to move a file called xxx.exe to at least 304 hosts, right? We're only going to make comments on evidence that we reviewed. There probably were more hosts impacted, but we reviewed and confirmed that 304 hosts had received that xxx.exe. Now there's a little bit of dwell time here, right? So they're spreading that file. They might be watching the copy of that file throughout the enterprise. At 0550 UTC, we start to see execution of the ransomware across the environment. Then the assumption here is that SkyLakes is now freaking out and is trying to restore stuff between 0550 and between 2000 when we start getting engaged. But during that time period, the adversary has announced their presence and they've started really wreaking havoc on things in the environment, right? After this period, we spent about a week or two working with SkyLakes trying to button up all the evidence and conclude what make sure we're drawing solid conclusions on it. And yeah, I think that's it for my description of the incident. Do you want to talk about lessons learned, Michael? Sure. Okay.
So I think lessons learned really, the first thing that I think we learned, and it's not here, but I think the first thing we learned is that when you're talking about this type of an incident, this really affects people. This affects patients. This affects how they live, the care they're going to be able to get. And so when we look at this and find out that you're necessarily unprepared, that's a constant process. That process is something that you have to look at on a continuous basis and have a continuous process of improvement. Because if you don't, then you could get caught in a situation where you're unaware and you don't have visibility and you don't know exactly what you're going to do in that type of situation. We did find that our insurance coverage for this similar events, it's expensive, of course, and since this event, our insurance has gone up, but I think everybody's insurance is going up, because cybersecurity insurance is definitely getting more expensive. I think the last time I looked at this, there were somewhere around 68 million pieces of information that's been exfiltrated from healthcare organizations just within the last year. Somewhere around, I think it was 514 hospital systems just within the last year. Senior management now, we basically went through several iterations, but now we've been able to implement an MDR. We're able to have 24/7 eyes on our network. We have a ticketing system for that within a SOC, and being able to work with them on a regular basis for SOAR type of processes, so that some of those things can read the IOCs. If there are IOCs that are detected within compromise, then we can act upon them more quickly. We definitely have better visibility with implementing a SIM, being able to understand what our users are doing, what things are being downloaded. If those things are downloaded, how are we going to mitigate it? We are in the process of implementing microsegmentation so that we can further isolate within the data center and not necessarily just within the endpoint protection. We do have, I think we've actually come together a little bit more as a hospital because things tend to become siloed. So you have a risk department in a hospital, but mainly what they do is they look at patient risk. You know, is a patient going to fall? Are they going to get the incorrect information? Is the proper information being put into their record in the EHR? Those types of things. So kind of adding a little bit more to the perspective of what that is within the risk organization, within how we're collaborating on operational resilience in a hospital, I think that becomes extremely important. The expansion of our security capabilities within our data management, not just with our EHR, but also within the systems that we're connected to, whether it's cloud, whether it's on-prem, how those systems interact, and how we're actually securing around them from a microsegmentation level. Also, we have now implemented integration between Cisco XDR, MDR, as well as our data management system platforms so that we have better visibility into what is there, how we need to mitigate, and how we need to move forward with making better decisions. Is this mine?
Well, I can talk about it. So there's one other bit which I think, Matthew,
Yes.
Persistence.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
the Active Directory server.
Yes.
Do you want to cover that quickly?
I don't. No, I don't. You
No,
mean just in general?
I can do it.
Yeah.
But so we already talked about. So Matthew talked about the utility of doing forensics on the data management platform, being able to go back in time, seeing that patient zero, like that email that came through, and when that ability to do forensics on those systems is somewhat, either through wipe or ransomware, is somewhat compromised, right? Or you might not even have the platforms up and running to be able to do that forensic analysis. The thing in this particular attack as well is the persistence mechanism was a GPO object in Active Directory. How did they find that? Well, they could look at what the Active Directory server looked like before the change was made, from its backup, and then after the change was made. So any form of those persistence mechanisms can now be discovered because you can reinstantiate those systems in seconds to have a look at them in those different states. And when we consider how many persistence mechanisms rely on binaries or changes to configuration files or GPO policies, that's an incredible ability to time travel that we don't use if us as security professionals do not talk to the data management team that are running the backup platforms. And I think, Michael talked about it earlier, their data management platform, luckily they were moving between a legacy platform and a newer platform, did not have the protections in place to prevent it from being encrypted. So if they were still in that historical situation, that ability to do forensics or even recover any of those systems would have been gone, right? And much worse patient incomes. So the first thing I'd say is make sure you've got a data management platform that is not susceptible to attack. But not just buying the platform, making sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on, that you have the right separation of duties and all those good practices on top of that data management platform.
Is it all right if I talk about backups real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon for our customers to have a backup solution in place. And when they call us for a ransomware attack, one of the adversary is usually dwelling for two reasons. One is they want to find where the crown jewels are and where the other items in your enterprise that they can monetize. And secondly is they want to find out where your backups are and be able to delete them before they execute their ransomware. And so, the majority of the time when we're involved in a customer investigation and they have a backup system in place, an online backup system, they're using the same enterprise admin accounts to manage that backup solution as they are to manage their network, which the adversary isn't even going to interact with it until they gain enterprise admin rights in your domain controller. And once they gain enterprise admin rights, which doesn't take them very long to do, they will delete your backups almost immediately prior to executing the ransomware. So by the time you notice your backups are gone, the ransomware is already executing, and there's nothing you can do about it. But having a really strong, robust, resilient backup solution in place will make or break your incident. And then, as also mentioned, multi-factor authentication is absolutely critical, not just to be in place if you'd like to use it, but be actually enforced and enforce the requirement to use multi-factor authentication for remote access. And I usually go one step further and mandate multi-factor authentication be used for any administrative function that's being executed in the environment. That one's a little trickier to implement, but I think it's worth the effort to implement it if you can, right? So I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. And I mean, the other thing that I've seen as well is, do you want to laterally move and discover 15,000 different machines within an enterprise to find sensitive data on it? Or if you gain access to the Black Hat platform, you've now got a single place that's got every piece of your critical information in which you can exfiltrate that data off. So that's why protecting those backups, not just from attack, but also from confidentiality perspective, people being able, without the rights, to get that data out of there. I think the other thing that this incident shows us is, what was the default response? A DR and BC response of trying to recover the data without first investigating the incident. And that just resulted in reinfection. I mentioned a wiper incident I was involved in. 17 different times we recovered there because we recovered all the artifacts of the attack. And we see, not in our customers so much, but in lots of the attacks that I dealt with as a historical incident responder, people do not investigate the incident enough to understand what vulnerabilities were exploited, what systems, because especially in ransomware response, we see organizations are only investigating the systems that were encrypted. Well, the beachheads are probably not the encrypted systems. They're ones they've moved through laterally, so the scope of the incident needs to be broad to make sure you get rid of all of those beachheads that they will use for re-attack, and in this case it was Active Directory, right? So that response process has to be there, but we need to break this cycle of thinking about ransomware incidents from an IT and a security perspective the way we have historically to be effective, right? And also the data management solution should be a resource that the security teams should be able to utilize, right, as a part of their solution. So, that was basically the 4 key takeaways from this. We've got 16 seconds left. So have we got enough time for one question? Has anyone got any questions?
I think we're the last talk of the day too. So.
Yeah.
Thank you for the interesting presentation. I work for Texas Children's, largest pediatric organization in the United States. So obviously, I understand very well what it means in terms of healthcare and ransomware. I had actually 2 questions. One was, one of the things that seem to happen quite a bit is not only that the backup system gets compromised, right? Like, so I would be interested to understand how you were securing your backup system to actually protect that against a ransomware attacker, right? Because that's part of the problem, that they seem to target, critical components of your recovery capabilities. And the other question I had was, and this is more for you, since you're seeing obviously many customers, is there a trend actually to move backups to security teams because it becomes more relevant to actually cybersecurity recovery than it is actually traditional data recovery efforts?
Shall I cover that? Yeah, so obviously I'm a CISO, I'm an operational guy, but I work for a company that makes a data management solution, right? So I get to see both sides, right? I have to protect our own capability to restore data because customers are relying on us to provide their restoration capability, but at the same time, we see what our customers are doing, right? And that's why a large part of my job is external facing, evangelizing the fact that it's not just deploying a solution, it's the approach around the solution and getting security and IT teams to work together. What I'm seeing is there is a base level of capability you need to have in a backup platform, right? So ideally, everyone, the CISA, the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK says 3, 2, 1. 3 backups, right? Two different locations, one has to be off-site, ideally outside of your tenant or domain of control. So we're seeing an awful lot of customers that are actually vaulting their initial clean rooming capability in the cloud outside of a tenant that's non-production. So they can spin it up like that and reinstantiate these instances to do forensics and the clean rooming activities really, really quickly. But then there's immutability, right? Making sure the platform can't be changed, right? So you write once and that gives you your forensics quality as well. So the file system, a data management solution can only be written to, never changed. Right? So all you can do is delete data, add data. Well, how do you stop an adversary deleting your data? Well, you have the concept of a data lock, the ability that only certain roles can delete that data, and then you separate those roles from the other roles, and then you add separation of duties so that that person on their own can't make that change. They have to go to another person to authorize, and maybe another one and another one. So you've got as many levels as you need for the right structure of your organization. And then you kind of surround the whole thing with zero trust principles, so no one can just add a component. There's mutual authentication, there's separation of the data plane, so you can use your own encryption keys from the management plane, right? So your data isn't visible to the vendor like ourselves. Your data is protected by your encryption keys, but we're able to provide the service on top of that. So that's the first question, right? Those protections I think are core. The second one is, are security teams starting to drive backup and recovery? No. Still owned by IT operations in almost every instance. But what I'm seeing is closer cooperation between the two. Like once they realize ransomware and wiper attacks are unlike anything else, the way I look at it as a CISO is, in ransomware, the CIO is holding the toilet chain, but all of the plumbing is provided by IT. Right? My ability to do forensics, because my systems are wiped or they're encrypted, and my ability to recover, my ability to even have my security tooling available is all dependent on IT. But we've got this nice NIST framework that kind of says, detect, protect, respond, recover. But you have to recover to respond. And then as you bring these forensic images back to do analysis, it's iterative, right? You have to do responding, recover. And my plea to most organizations is they sort those workflows out and they don't go straight to recover. Things like that. So I am seeing a lot of security capability being put into data management solutions. Yeah. So without, because we're not in a commercial situation here, but the ability to scan for IOCs, right? You've got a backup over months of a file system. If you're looking for file IOCs, what's a better place to do it? Classifying data. Well, you can use a platform where you have to give authentication credentials to it, but you brought all your data back to a central place, and you can work out how many records from each country, each state is in the blast radius of an attack. The ability to scan for vulnerabilities, right? Instead of scanning a live system, scan a backup, right? Instantiate that backup, scan that, and then at that point of attack what vulnerabilities are on that system, whereas your monthly cadence of scanning might not be able to pick that up because you got attacked in the middle of that cadence, right? So, I'm very excited in my ability to use backup as a part of security operations because I never thought of it, right? It's an IT-owned thing and I don't talk to those guys, right? But since, coming into an organization which is obviously heavily focused on the utility of backup, it's kind of opened my eyes a bit to what's done. Is there any
If you don't
guys
mind me
wanna-
interjecting on,
Yeah.
I apologize. Yeah, so I do have a customer whose backup team doesn't report to the security team, but he sits in their same office with them. And during incidents, he's just treated as though he's part of the security team. So I do know of one situation where, while they are separate, they're very tightly integrated and they work together during incidents. But I apologize, Michael.
No, that's fine. I was just going to say that when we started down this road and we realized that we were hit, the biggest thing that we were concerned about wasn't necessarily how we were going to restore. It was more, are we going to get reinfected?
Yeah.
Because that's what we started to see, on a consistent basis. Because your first knee-jerk reaction when you fall into a situation like that is to restore. Recover. We have patients, we have, a workforce that's relying upon us, for a medical system. And so that was the biggest thing. Are we going to get reinfected? And so as we started to see that, then we started to look at, other mechanisms, bring in, another incident response, use the data tools that we had recently, put into place. From a technical perspective, looking at Active Directory, I was able to actually take the DIT file, which is the actual database of Active Directory, pull it apart, and then take a look at, systems that were infected, and then the systems that weren't, and then how those Active Directory security descriptors, read across. And we did that for probably a good 2 weeks before we decided to actually restore. And then, get rid of everybody's passwords, change all those passwords, all those kinds of things. But getting to a point where we were comfortable enough to be able to say that, our Active Directory, because let's face it, when you have an Active Directory that's been built for 30 years, it's going to take another 30 years to rebuild it. So, but being able to go through it and pull that apart with the tools that we had implemented, and then with the assistance that we had, it was priceless.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm gonna say that this is probably a discussion that is ripe for cocktail hour down in the reception hall. Great presentation, and thank you very much. But yeah, we do have a reception downstairs, so be wonderful to keep this going there.
All right, thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.